The throne room of Malakar's keep stretched upward into darkness, its vaulted ceiling lost somewhere beyond the reach of torchlight. Down here at the bottom of that vast stone throat sat Uldrek Voss, demon lord of the Ashen Reaches, ruler of 7 provinces and master of an army that had never once tasted defeat. He sat alone, as he always did, his clawed fingers drumming against the obsidian armrest of a throne built to remind everyone who looked upon it that here sat something greater than a man. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent 3 centuries clawing his way to this seat, spilling the blood of rivals and mentors alike, whispering promises he never intended to keep and keeping promises that cost him everything else. He had wanted this throne the way a starving man wants bread. Now he sat upon it most nights with nothing but the echo of his own breathing for company, and he wondered when exactly the hunger had curdled into something else. His generals feared him, that was expected, even necessary. A demon lord who inspired comfort was a demon lord already halfway to a knife in the back, but fear, he had learned, was a peculiar kind of solitude. It built walls faster than any siege engine could tear them down. When Khazrith the Undying knelt before him and offered counsel, Uldrek could never be certain if the advice served the Empire or simply the desire to avoid a slow and creative death. When the court mage Selvath praised his strategic brilliance, Uldrek heard only the tremor beneath the words, the fear dressed up as flattery. He had not always been alone. There had been a time centuries ago when he was simply Uldrek, not yet a lord, not yet a king, just a young demon with ambition burning in his chest like a coal that refused to cool. In those days he had companions, Rivak, who fought beside him in the border wars, Esira, who taught him the old magics before the crown made such teachers unnecessary. They had laughed together, plotted together, dreamed of a world remade in their image. He could still remember the sound of Rivak's laughter, rough and sudden like a rock slide. Rivak was dead now, of course. Uldrek had killed him himself on the night he claimed the throne because Rivak had stood in the doorway of the old king's chambers and asked him not to do what he was about to do. Esira had fled the Reaches entirely, vanishing into the western wastes rather than watch what her friend was becoming. Uldrek told himself in the early years that this was simply the price of power. Every king shed his old skin, every ruler outgrew the friendships of his youth. But the telling had grown thin over the decades, worn down like a coin passed through too many hands, and what remained beneath it looked uncomfortably like grief. Tonight, as on most nights, he descended from the throne once the last petitioner had been dismissed and walked the empty corridors of his keep alone. His guards fell into step a respectful distance behind him, close enough to protect, far enough to never be mistaken for companions. He passed the great hall where feasts were held in his honor, tables groaning under the weight of delicacies from 6 kingdoms, populated by nobles who raised their goblets to his health and watched him from the corners of their eyes like men watching a sleeping predator. He passed the gardens, tended by servants who bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the earth, flowers blooming in colors that did not exist in nature because he had once mentioned offhand that he found natural colors tedious. Everything in this keep existed to please him, and none of it touched him at all. He found himself, as he often did, standing before the window in the eastern tower, looking out over the Ashen Reaches spread below like a map of his own life's work. Volcanic plains stretched to the horizon, dotted with the fortified villages of his subjects, threaded through with roads his armies had built over the bones of his enemies. It was, by any measure, a magnificent kingdom. He had built something that would outlast him, something that scholars would study and rival lords would envy for generations to come. He would have traded all of it in that moment for someone to stand beside him at that window who was not afraid to speak an honest word. There was a knock at the door of his private chambers, rare enough that his hand went instinctively to the hilt of his blade before he registered the particular rhythm of it. 3 sharp strikes, then 2 soft ones. It was a code known only to Gurn, his oldest surviving advisor, a demon who had served him since before the crown, who had somehow managed to survive 3 centuries of Uldrek's rule without ever quite becoming an enemy or a friend. "Enter," Uldrek said, and did not turn from the window. Gurn's footsteps were careful on the stone floor, the careful steps of a man who had learned long ago that sudden movements around the demon lord were unwise. "My lord, the envoy from the Sunless Kingdom has arrived early. He requests an audience at your earliest convenience." "Tomorrow," Uldrek said. "Tell him tomorrow." A pause. Gurn was not a man who filled silences carelessly. "Is something troubling you, my lord?" Uldrek almost laughed, almost. It had been so long since anyone had asked him that question and meant it as more than a formality, a ritual bow before the real business of court began, that he had nearly forgotten how strange it felt to be asked at all. He turned from the window and studied Gurn's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the careful neutrality of his expression, the way his gaze never quite settled anywhere near Uldrek's own eyes. "No," Uldrek said finally, "nothing troubles me. Kings do not trouble easily." Gurn bowed and withdrew, and Uldrek was alone again, exactly as he had arranged his entire existence to ensure. He stood at the window until the volcanic glow of the horizon faded into true night, and he thought, not for the first time, that there was a particular cruelty in having exactly what you wanted and discovering it was not enough. Sleep did not come easily to demon lords, or perhaps it simply did not come easily to Uldrek Voss specifically, burdened as he was with 3 centuries of decisions that revisited him in the dark like creditors calling in debts. That night after Gurn's departure, he lay upon a bed large enough for a dozen bodies and found himself thinking, against his will, of Essira. He had not allowed himself to think of her properly in decades. It was easier that way, easier to keep her memory sealed behind the same walls that kept everything else at bay. But something about the quality of tonight's loneliness had cracked the seal, and now the memories came flooding through whether he wanted them or not. She had taught him magic in a small stone tower on the edge of the Old Kingdom, back when he was young enough to still ask questions without fear of how they made him look. Essira had never treated him as anything other than a student who occasionally showed promise and often showed stubbornness. She corrected his mistakes without cruelty and praised his successes without flattery, and there had been something profoundly restful in that honesty, something he had not appreciated until it was gone. The night he took the throne, she had come to him, not to stop him. She was wiser than Rivak in that regard, understanding that some avalanches could not be halted once they began their descent. She had simply asked him one question: "Do you know what you are becoming?" He had not answered her. He had not known how to answer her. And by the time he found words months later, words that might have explained the fear and ambition tangled together in his chest, she was already gone, having slipped away into the western wastes with nothing but a traveling cloak and whatever magic she could carry. He had sent scouts to find her in those early years, not to harm her. He told himself that firmly, though he was never entirely certain it was true, but simply to know that she was safe, that she had found some peace in her self-imposed exile. The scouts never found her. Essira had always been better at disappearing than anyone gave her credit for. Rivak's memory was harder to sit with because there was no ambiguity in that grief, no comfortable distance of unresolved questions. Rivak had died on the point of Uldrek's own blade, in the doorway of a chamber neither of them had any right to enter, and the last words that passed between them had been an argument neither had won. Uldrek could still see his old friend's face in that final moment, not fear, which might have been easier to bear, but a terrible, exhausted disappointment, as though Rivak had been hoping until the very last second that Uldrek would choose differently. He had not chosen differently. He had chosen the throne, and the throne had cost him everything that made the throne worth having. These were not thoughts a demon lord was meant to entertain, and Uldrek knew this with the same certainty he knew the shape of his own claws. Weakness, his old masters would have called it, this backward-looking sentiment, this yearning for connections that had no place in the calculus of power, and yet he found himself unable to simply banish the thoughts by force of will, as he had banished so much else in his long and bloody career. Morning came as it always did, painting the volcanic sky in shades of orange and grey that Uldrek had once found beautiful and now simply found familiar. He rose, dressed in the dark armor that had become as much a part of him as his own skin, and descended to the throne room to begin the business of ruling an empire that ran, by now, almost entirely on its own momentum. The envoy from the Sunless Kingdom proved to be a nervous, narrow creature named Voss, who bowed so many times during his approach to the throne that Uldrek found himself counting them out of sheer boredom. Voth's message was the usual diplomatic theatre, professions of eternal friendship wrapped around requests for trade concessions, flattery calibrated to the exact degree that would please without seeming excessive. Uldrek listened with half his attention and granted half of what was asked, which was more generous than the situation strictly required and less generous than Voth had hoped, which was, in Uldrek's experience, precisely the correct balance to maintain in these matters. After Voth's departure, there was the usual parade of lesser business, tax disputes between provincial lords, a request for military reinforcement along the northern border, a report on the progress of the new fortress being constructed in the mountain passes. Uldrek handled each matter with the efficient detachment that had become his signature as a ruler dispensing judgment the way a machine might dispense coins, precise and untroubled by sentiment. It was during a lull in the proceedings, as the court prepared for the midday recess, that something unusual happened, unusual enough that Uldrek would remember it for weeks afterward as the first crack in the careful architecture of his solitude. A young demon, barely more than a child by the reckoning of his kind, broke from the crowd of onlookers at the edge of the hall and darted forward before the guards could react. He could not have been more than 50 years old, still soft-featured in the way of young demons who had not yet grown into their full and terrible potential. He stumbled to a halt perhaps 10 paces from the throne, close enough that Uldrek could see the fear and determination warring in his small face. "My lord," the boy said, voice cracking, "my lord, please, my mother is sick and the healers in our village say only royal magic can save her. I know I'm not supposed to be here, I know I should have asked through proper channels, but she doesn't have time for proper channels, my lord, please." The guards had already moved to seize him, hands rough on his thin shoulders, and the boy's composure broke into open weeping even as he continued to plead his case. Uldrek watched this unfold with an expression that gave away nothing of what stirred behind it, because something did stir, something he had not felt in a very long time, a small and uncomfortable flicker of recognition. He remembered being that desperate once. He remembered a time when he, too, had believed that raw honesty might be enough to move the world. "Release him," Uldrek said. The hall went silent. Even the guards hesitated, uncertain they had heard correctly, and Uldrek repeated the command with enough weight behind it that they scrambled to comply. The boy stood trembling before the throne, no longer certain whether he had won a reprieve or simply delayed a harsher punishment. "What is your mother's illness?" Uldrek asked. The boy stammered out a description, a wasting sickness, something that had crept into her lungs over the past several months, something the village healers lacked the skill to cure. Uldrek listened, and as he listened, he found himself remembering Esira's teachings on healing magic, lessons he had absorbed decades ago and rarely had occasion to use, since demon lords were not generally in the business of curing illness. "I will send my personal physician to your village," Uldrek said, and the words surprised him even as he spoke them, some part of his mind observing this decision with detached curiosity, as though watching a stranger act through his own body. She will be tended to properly. You will return home today, and you will not attempt to approach my throne again without proper channels. Do you understand? The boy nodded frantically, torn between gratitude and residual terror, and was ushered from the hall by guards who seemed almost as confused by the outcome as he was. Uldrek watched him go and felt, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, the first genuine satisfaction he had experienced in longer than he cared to admit. It was such a small thing, a minor act of mercy that cost him nothing and would likely never be mentioned again in the official records of his reign. And yet it sat with him for the remainder of the day, a small warm coal in the center of a chest that had grown accustomed to cold. That evening, as he prepared to retire, he found himself wondering when he had last done something simply because it was kind, rather than because it served some larger strategic purpose. He could not remember. The realization was not comfortable, but for the first time in years, the discomfort felt like it might be leading somewhere worth going. The days that followed brought no dramatic transformation. Uldrek Voss did not wake one morning and decide to become a different sort of ruler, did not abandon the calculated cruelties that had built and maintained his empire. But something had shifted subtly in the way he moved through his own existence, like a stone that has been sitting in one position for so long that even a small displacement changes the entire pattern of moss and shadow around it. He found himself more often now lingering in places where he might overhear the unguarded conversations of his subjects, not to spy exactly, though he supposed that was technically what he was doing, but simply to hear voices that were not calibrated for his benefit, opinions that had not been filtered through the particular anxiety of addressing a demon lord directly. He learned things this way that his advisors would never have told him. He learned that the eastern farmers were struggling under a tax burden that looked reasonable on paper but crushing in practice. He learned that his soldiers, for all their professed loyalty, held genuine affection for their immediate commanders in a way they never expressed toward him, and that this affection ran deeper and truer than anything directed at the throne itself. He learned, too, that he was often the subject of quiet speculation, not the fearful whispers he expected, but something more complicated. His subjects wondered about him. They told stories about the young demon he had been before the crown, stories that had grown into something like folklore, softened and reshaped by decades of retelling until they bore only passing resemblance to the truth. In some versions, he was a tragic figure, a good soul corrupted by the weight of power he never wanted. In others, he was simply inevitable, a force of nature that could not have been anything other than what he became. None of the stories asked him what he thought about any of it. This did not surprise him, but it did, in the quiet privacy of his own reflection, sting more than he expected. The physician he had sent to heal the young demon's mother returned with a report that the treatment had succeeded, and something in Uldrek had wanted absurdly to visit the village himself and see the result of his mercy with his own eyes. He did not do this. It would have caused chaos, panic, an entire village thrown into disarray by the unprecedented presence of their ruler in the flesh. But the wanting itself was new, and he turned it over in his mind for days afterward, examining it like an artifact of uncertain origin. It was Gurn who finally addressed the change directly, though he did so with the careful indirection that 3 centuries of service had taught him was necessary when approaching sensitive subjects with his lord. "The court has noticed a difference in you, my lord," Gurn said during one of their regular evening briefings. They sat in Uldrek's private study, a room lined with books that Uldrek rarely had time to read and maps that charted conquests both completed and merely imagined. "Some speak of it favorably, others express concern that you may be losing your edge." And what do you think, Gurns? The question was direct enough that Gurn actually paused before answering, a rare enough occurrence that Uldrek found himself genuinely curious about what honest answer might emerge from beneath the careful diplomatic instincts of his oldest advisor. I think, Gurn said slowly, that I have served 3 demon lords in my long life, my lord, and each of them ruled through fear alone, and each of them died alone, surrounded by subjects who celebrated their deaths in private even as they mourned them in public. I have wondered sometimes whether there might be another way to hold power. I do not know if there is, but I confess I am curious to see what happens if you attempt to find out. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Uldrek in decades, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. He sat with the words for a long moment, turning them over, testing their weight against everything he had believed about the nature of rulership. "You think I am becoming weak," he said finally. "I think," Gurn replied, "that mercy and weakness are not the same thing, though many rulers confuse them, usually to their own detriment. A weak king cannot punish when punishment is warranted. A merciful king simply understands that punishment is not always the correct tool for every situation. I have watched you rule for 3 centuries, my lord. I do not believe you have grown weak. I believe you have grown tired of being alone, and I believe that exhaustion is finally outweighing your fear of what connection might cost you." Uldrek did not respond to this immediately. He rose instead and walked to the window, looking out over the same volcanic landscape he had studied 100 times before, searching it now for something he could not quite name. "Rivak asked me once," he said, "whether the throne was worth what it would cost. I told him the question was meaningless, that power justified its own price. I have wondered since then if I was answering him or trying to convince myself." "Rivak has been dead for nearly 300 years, my lord." "I am aware of that, Gurns." "Then perhaps," Gurn said carefully, "it is time to stop arguing with his ghost and start considering what you actually believe, unburdened by whatever guilt you still carry from that particular decision." It was bold advice, bordering on insubordination, and a lesser advisor might have found himself facing severe consequences for such directness. But Uldrek found himself instead grateful, genuinely uncomfortably grateful, for someone willing to speak to him as though he were capable of hearing hard truths rather than someone who needed to be managed and appeased. "What would you have me do?" Uldrek asked, and the question was not rhetorical. Gurn considered this seriously before answering. "I would have you remember that you were not always alone, my lord. I would have you consider whether the isolation you have built around yourself was ever truly necessary for your power, or whether it was simply the easiest path to avoid being hurt again the way you were hurt when you lost your friends. And I would have you consider," he added more quietly, "that it is not too late to build something different, even now, even after everything." That night, Uldrek did something he had not done in over a century. He wrote a letter. It was addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps it was addressed to Esira or Rivak or the version of himself that had existed before the crown reshaped everything he understood about his own nature. He wrote about the loneliness that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue, about the small warmth he had felt when he showed mercy to a frightened child, about the years of careful distance that had protected him from further loss, while also ensuring he had nothing left worth protecting. He did not send the letter because there was no one to send it to, but he kept it, folded carefully and placed within a drawer of his private desk, and the act of writing it felt like the first honest conversation he had conducted with himself in longer than he could remember. The following months brought small, incremental changes to the court of Uldrek Voss, changes so gradual that no single moment could be identified as the turning point, though the cumulative effect was unmistakable to anyone who had known the Demon Lord before the shift began. He started attending the evening meals of his household staff, not as a lord observing his subjects, but simply sitting among them, listening to their conversations, occasionally offering his own thoughts on matters that had nothing to do with governance or war. The staff found this deeply unsettling at first. 3 centuries of careful conditioning had taught them that proximity to the Demon Lord was dangerous, that his attention was something to be avoided rather than welcomed. But Uldrek was patient in a way he had never needed to be patient before, and slowly, cautiously, some of the ice began to thaw. A cook named Yessa, who had served the royal kitchens for 40 years, was the first to speak to him without visible trembling, offering an opinion on the quality of imported spices that had nothing whatsoever to do with matters of state. Uldrek found himself laughing at her dry commentary on the incompetence of certain merchants, a genuine laugh that surprised him with its unfamiliarity. He sought out news of the young demon whose mother he had healed, and learned that the boy had grown into something of a local legend himself, the child who had dared approach the throne and lived to tell of it. Uldrek arranged, through careful and indirect channels, for the boy to receive an education befitting someone with genuine magical aptitude, which the physician's reports suggested he possessed. He did not reveal his own role in this arrangement, preferring to let the mercy exist without the complication of gratitude or debt. Gurn noticed these changes and said nothing further about them, though Uldrek caught him, on more than one occasion, watching with an expression that might have been approval or might have simply been the particular satisfaction of a man watching a long-held theory prove correct. The larger political consequences of Uldrek's transformation were more complicated. Some of his provincial lords, accustomed to ruling through the same fear-based methods that had once defined their king, grumbled about weakness at the center of power. 2 of them, emboldened by what they perceived as vulnerability, attempted a coordinated rebellion in the southern territories, believing that a demon lord who had grown soft would prove easy to overthrow. They were wrong, and their error cost them everything. Uldrek crushed the rebellion with the same efficient brutality that had characterized his earliest conquests, reminding everyone who watched that mercy and weakness remained, as Gurn had observed, entirely different qualities. But in the aftermath, rather than simply executing the rebellious lord's entire households as tradition and precedent might have suggested, he offered clemency to those who had not directly participated in the rebellion, sparing children and spouses who bore no responsibility for their father's ambitions. This decision, more than any other, seemed to crystallize something in the collective understanding of his subjects. He was not becoming soft, he was becoming something else entirely, a ruler who understood that strength and cruelty were not synonymous, that a kingdom held together purely through terror was fundamentally fragile in ways that a kingdom bound by something more complex might not be. It was nearly a year after that first small act of mercy toward the frightened child that Uldrek received word of a traveler passing through the western border of his territory, an old demon woman, according to the reports, who had been living in self-imposed exile in the wastes for centuries and had recently begun making her way back toward civilization. The description matched no one Uldrek could immediately place, until the report mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had been observed practicing healing magic to assist a village suffering from a plague that had resisted conventional treatment. He knew with a certainty that defied logical explanation that it was Essira. He did not send soldiers to retrieve her, understanding that such an approach would only drive her further away, would confirm every fear that had led to her exile in the first place. Instead, he sent a single messenger carrying no demands and no royal seal, simply a letter written in his own hand. It was not the letter he had written in the privacy of his study months before, the one still folded in his desk drawer, but it drew from the same well of honesty that letter had first tapped. He wrote about the years since her departure, about the throne and everything it had cost him, about the isolation he had built as both fortress and prison. He wrote about Rivak and the guilt that had never fully released its grip on him, and the strange peace he had found in finally acknowledging that guilt rather than burying it beneath centuries of denial. He did not ask her to return. He simply asked whether she might be willing to correspond, to rebuild, in whatever small way might be possible, something of the honesty that had once existed between them. The response took 3 months to arrive, carried by the same messenger who had delivered the original letter, now looking considerably more weathered from his long journey into the western wastes and back. Uldrek opened it alone in his private study, with a nervousness that felt entirely foreign to a demon who had faced down armies without flinching. Esira's handwriting had changed little in the centuries since he had last seen it. She wrote of her own journey, the guilt she carried for abandoning him when he might have benefited from a friend willing to challenge his choices rather than simply mourn them from a distance. She wrote that she had followed reports of his reign from afar, cautiously, uncertain what to make of the stories that reached her in her isolation. And she wrote in her final lines that she would be willing to visit, not as a subject returning to her king, but as an old friend curious to see what had become of the student she once knew. Uldrek read the letter 3 times before setting it down, and found himself experiencing an emotion he could not immediately name, something adjacent to hope, though hope had been such a stranger to him for so long that he barely recognized its shape. The throne room of Malakar's keep still stretched upward into shadows that torchlight could not fully banish. The volcanic plains still spread beyond the windows in shades of orange and grey. Uldrek Voss remained, in every meaningful sense, the demon lord of the Ashen Reaches, ruler of 7 provinces, commander of armies that had never tasted defeat. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his existence, some load-bearing wall of isolation finally beginning to crack under the pressure of accumulated small choices toward connection rather than distance. He understood, sitting alone in his study with Esira's letter in his hands, that the throne itself would never be less lonely by its very nature, that the weight of ultimate power carried with it an isolation that could not be entirely undone, no matter how many small mercies he extended or old friendships he attempted to rebuild. But he understood, too, that loneliness and isolation were not quite the same thing, that it was possible to sit upon the loneliest throne in the Ashen Reaches and still reach outward, still build bridges toward the people and relationships that power had taught him to sacrifice. It would not be simple. Esira's visit, when it finally came months later, would prove complicated by centuries of accumulated distance and hurt that could not be resolved in a single conversation. The provincial lords would continue to test the boundaries of his newfound approach to rulership, and he would continue to demonstrate, when necessary, that mercy had limits and consequences remained real. Gurn would grow older and eventually pass from this world, as advisors do, and Uldrek would grieve him properly, without the careful distance he had once maintained from all such losses. But on that particular evening, with Esira's letter still warm from his hands and the volcanic sunset painting his study in shades of amber, Uldrek Voss allowed himself something he had denied himself for the better part of 3 centuries. The quiet, uncertain hope that the throne he had sacrificed everything to claim might yet become something other than merely lonely, that even a demon lord might find his way back to the kind of honest connection he had once believed power required him to abandon forever. The crown remained heavy. Some weights, he understood now, were simply the price of what he had chosen to become. But he no longer believed that weight and isolation were inseparable companions, and in that understanding, however incomplete, he found something that felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, remarkably like peace.